The deeds of jihadi militants are often so brutal and cruel that it's about all we know of the people perpetrating such acts. Our next guest gets beyond that initial impression in his new book, examining the practices that these people employ to fortify their extremism. The book is called Jihadi Culture, the Art and Social Practices of Militant Islamists, and its editor is Thomas Hegghammer. He is a senior fellow at the Norwegian Defence Research Establishment, and he joins us now via Skype from Kjeller, Norway, which is near Oslo. And Thomas, it's good to meet you. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Excellent. Let's just start by seeing if we can narrow this down a bit. The jihadis that you are writing about in your book, who are they?
We know them mostly, of course, in the form of the Al-Qaeda organization or Islamic State, but it's really a movement with activists and sympathizers around the world. And it's a movement that is several decades old. It's been around for many years, and Islamic State, it's just the latest iteration of it.
That's the point I wanted to get to. I mean, you're talking also about Chechens, you're talking about Islamists in Somalia, Nigeria, during the Soviet Union time. We're not just talking about ISIS today, right?
That's right. And what all these people have in common is that they say that they wage jihad, which they consider a sort of a legitimate holy war, and most of them see themselves as waging a defensive war against what they see as typically kind of non-Muslim assaults on the Muslim nation, the Ummah as they call it, and they believe that they are merely sort of defending themselves against this sort of external assault, and for that reason they think allowed to use all kinds of methods in that struggle.
Now, there may be a belief among many watching this right now that these militant Islamists actually lead sinful lives behind a facade of piety. You, having researched this now, what can you tell us about how true or false that impression may be?
Well, there's certainly something to that assertion, because many of the recruits come from backgrounds of crime or delinquency. We've seen that with many of the foreign fighters who've gone from Europe in particular. But what I've seen when I studied life inside the groups was that they were actually really quite pious and observant. They followed all of the kind of prescribed orthodox rituals, and they're very, very concerned about being good Muslims, as it were. And so what I think is happening is that these people come from non-observant backgrounds, but once they're inside the groups, they are actually quite observant.
Now, many, of course, live in very hostile territory, and I wonder whether strictly adhering to all of the tenets of their faith ever runs into, difficulties with their own safety.
Yes, of course, and I'm speaking here of the kind of the sort of small rituals pertaining to the individual, the prayers and ablutions and all this sort of thing, not the kind of the broader political ideals that they're fighting for, because those are very much contested by other Muslims.
So let's ask a bit of an unconventional question here. If you're a jihadi warrior, is it okay to cry?
Absolutely. In fact, it's not just okay, it's appreciated. People are encouraged to weep because it's seen as a sign of piety and as a sign of strong faith. And so we see in video recordings from inside the groups or in autobiographies by fighters, lots of depictions of people crying in groups. And there's no contradiction between being a brutal and fearless fighter on the one hand and crying and weeping on the other. So to put it bluntly, you can basically, you can fight in the morning and weep in the afternoon if you are a jihadi.
And there's no contradiction there?
No. So we're dealing with a rather different conception of masculinity, I suppose, from the kind of the mainstream Western one. And so it's a world where kind of sentimentality and kind of expressions of emotions are not at odds with bravery and courage and manliness.
Well, let's do an example here. Al-Zarqawi, who was the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq, the forerunner to ISIS, was, of course, known to jihadis by his nickname, the Slaughterer, but he also had another nickname. What was that?
That was He Who Weeps a Lot.
And what earned him that title?
Well, apparently it was that he tended to weep a lot inside the group when people on the outside were not watching. When he was with his fellow fighters, and when they were reciting the Quran or listening to sort of jihadi hymns or watching films, he would weep more than the others.
Well, let's go from weeping to another collective activity. We've got some tape we want to play, and then we'll move on from there. Go ahead, Sheldon, roll it. Thomas, what were we just listening to there?
So this was an example of jihadi music. They call it anashid, and this is basically a type of hymn that's sung a cappella. It's always sung a cappella without instruments because they believe that instruments have the power to provoke or sort of sexual or sensual impulses in people, and they want to avoid that. So they sing a cappella, and they have developed an entire industry of jihadi music production with thousands of anashid like this. And the one that we just heard is a relatively recent one. Was produced by Islamic State, I think around 2014, and it basically celebrates the establishment of the Caliphate, or the declaration of the Caliphate.
And what exactly were they singing about there?
Well, he was saying that sort of my ummah, my Muslim nation has a new dawn, and that the Islamic State has arisen or been established. So this was, I think, created to accompany the declaration in mid-2014 when Islamic State seized Western Iraq and declared a caliphate.
Well, Thomas, can I ask you a bit of a smart aleck question here?
Absolutely.
Okay. Reading right out of your book right now, here are some of the lyrics that they sing. Robbed of my childhood and youth, I remain radiant despite life's darkness. Steadfast I stay on despite my injuries. Patient I prevail despite my pain. I shall not be cowed into submission. Do I take it they probably were not singing that when Raqqa fell?
I should think so. Yeah, what happens when they are faced with defeat and resistance is that they play up a sort of victim narrative, that they are suffering at the hands of the wicked and evil infidel. So you can basically write music for sort of any occasion or any sort of strategic situation. And perhaps for that reason, this is a very popular sort of cultural product inside the jihadi movement. It's probably the most important one. You see it everywhere. It's used in all of their propaganda films. You can see that they listen to it in all kinds of contexts, in their sort of safe houses, in their cars, in the training camps, everywhere. They are about as kind of obsessed with their music as young people are with pop music in our part of the world.
Let's examine another part of their culture. What kind of significance do they place on dreams?
They are almost obsessed with dreams and the content of their own dreams, and that is because they believe, as do many religious Muslims, by the way, that dreams are a potential channel of communication between God and man. So, to put it very simply, they believe that God can sort of pass on messages through dreams, typically hints about what is going to happen in the future, or um, uh, suggestions about what the individual who's having the dream should do. And so, because there are potentially these messages coming through dreams, they are really scared of missing a message. It's as if God is calling and they don't want to miss the call. So they discuss their dreams very often, typically in the morning when they can remember them, and they often talk about how the dream can be interpreted and what it might mean. And what's so fascinating about jihadis and dreams is that many jihadis say that they take important decisions based on their dreams. It goes from foot soldiers who often say that they decided to join the group after having a dream, up to commanders saying that they chose a particular military strategy over another based on their dream. So it's a really interesting phenomenon.
And what do we know about what Osama bin Laden thought about dreams?
Well, he, like everyone else in the movement, believed that what he or the people close around him dreamt, that this could convey important information about what would happen, what was going to happen to them, or what was going to happen, for example, to their impending operations. And there's this famous account of a dream about that they interpreted as the kind of the coming success of the 9/11 operations. But there are lots and lots of sort of dream accounts like this, and the person who wrote the chapter on this topic in the book, Ian Edgar, has documented this in fascinating detail.
Thomas, I want to bring up an image at this point from your book. This is some jihadi art, and it looks very much like the kind of, well, you know, Western superhero video game movie production type of thing that you might see, you know, people in the West looking at. You know, what's the whole point and purpose behind this?
Well, this is probably to recruit. It's to it's telling prospective recruits that you can be like this if you join us, and this is probably intended towards an sort of a recruitment pool, probably in the West, because it's quite Western inspired. And it tells us at least two things. One is that the movement in general, it really celebrates the warrior, and it kind of idealizes the warrior, and they kind of see themselves as valiant knights, as it were, as noble warriors. There's a sort of romanticism there that seeps through much of their cultural production. The other thing that the picture shows is that this is a culture that's quite open to borrowing from other cultures, including that of their enemies. So here they borrow from basically Hollywood. We also see them borrowing from images from basically the gaming industry, so this suggests to me that this culture does something very important to it, because this is otherwise a very conservative movement. They don't usually compromise on doctrinal principles and the like, but in the cultural domain they're quite open and flexible. And I think it means that they are somehow dependent on this culture in some way, or they're using it for something important.
Okay, Thomas, here comes smart aleck question number 2. I appreciate that you are trying to shine a light on the artistic/cultural angle of this movement. I wonder whether you're concerned that there is a danger here that you and those who write in the book are, in effect, humanizing terrorists.
Yes, this is an objection that's sometimes raised against the book, and it's what I usually say is that uh, there's a long tradition for doing this type of work on um, groups or people that are waging illegitimate struggle. It's basically about, just at some level, it's about knowing the enemy. It's about understanding what is making them tick and why they're doing what they're doing. But another way of looking at it is that we're dealing with a kind of sort of an unwanted phenomenon, it's a sort of a social problem of sorts, and this type of granular insider view is helping us kind of make that problem smaller. So one of the main reasons for doing this is to make this problem smaller and to help stop or radicalization and that sort of thing. That is the kind of the overall one of the main objectives with this project.
I'm just wondering, though, what you would say to those who think that this is a big waste of time trying to understand the culture behind what they're doing. They might suggest, why don't we just spend our time trying to wipe them out and never mind all of this? What's the response to that?
Well, the first practical problem is that we know now from 15 years of the war on terror that it's practically very difficult, if not impossible, to do so at just a practical level. This is a movement that is too large for us to do so. The other objection is, of course, the normative of the legal or moral one, which is that we're dealing with such a large movement, and it's, I think, questionable whether it would be wise or right to sort of kill everyone. And what I think we've learned over these years is that a targeted approach is much better, because often if you use excessive violence, you make the problem bigger. You make more people, you make the people who are standing by angry at what you just did. So to handle this problem, I think we're much better served with a calibrated or targeted approach. And I would say that is effectively what Western governments and other governments have been doing over the past 10 years as well, trying to deliver as much of damage to these organizations while causing a minimum of sort of collateral damage.
Let's finish up on this in our last couple of minutes here then. How can understanding or getting a better understanding of jihadi culture help Western countries challenge the narrative that they have tried to advance?
Well, for one, it can help us design better kind of counter propaganda that will actually be listened to or have an impact on the audience. Because this, for example, this research tells us that emotions are very, very important to the decisions behind the violence. So we're probably better served by appealing to kind of their emotions rather to their intellect or sort of cognitive domain. So that's one use. Another use is for intelligence analysts to get a better understanding of how a group functions and what the atmosphere inside the group is, because this sort of thing, it can tell us things about the group that is not articulated explicitly in text. And by studying kind of their behavior, we can get at certain things that we wouldn't otherwise see.
And one last question. Do you think the jihadis themselves will be angry at you for softening their rugged image with this book?
Oh, that's a very good question. No, I don't think so, because they are quite open about their sort of artistic sensibilities and their kind of their emotional life. They're weeping, as I mentioned. This is something that they're not trying to hide. So I don't think they would mind me analyzing it from an academic point of view.
Understood. That's Thomas Hegghammer. His book, Jihadi Culture, The Art and Social Practices of Militant Islamists. He's an adjunct professor at the University of Oslo, and we are glad that you joined us via Skype from Kjeller in Norway. Thanks so much, Thomas.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.